Hello, and welcome to Echoes of the Forgotten Earth, a place where curiosity settles in quietly beside you, while the riddles of our past stretch out with no need to rush. Tonight's path begins beneath the same vault of sky that has watched this planet far longer than we've been spinning tales about it. Those skies were here before there were skylines, before there were calendars on walls, before a single historian set ink to a page. If you let your imagination open up a little, you can almost sense that very same sky gazing down on people whose names never reached us. People who may have shaped the world you and I move through every day, without leaving any signature we can read. It isn't the kind of mystery that lurks in the dark. It isn't even necessarily about hidden secrets. It has more to do with something softer, almost well-mannered, the sort of mystery that stands in plain view and patiently waits for someone to really look at it. All over the surface of our planet, traces have been left behind. Some are carved directly into stone. Others live in the contours and distortions of old maps. Still others are woven into stories told so many times that no one remembers who first spoke them aloud. And tonight, we're going to let our thoughts drift along those traces toward a simple yet strangely powerful question. What if a whole civilization once lived, flourished, and even helped shape our world, and we've completely forgotten they were ever here? Before we start hunting for those hints together, I'd like to pause and picture where you are in this moment. Maybe you're sitting somewhere still and quiet with a drink resting near your hand. Maybe you're winding down from a long, heavy day, not quite ready to hand yourself over to sleep. Maybe your attention is split, half on this screen, half on something small happening in your room. I find myself wondering what the sky looks like beyond your window right now. If it's dark where you are, maybe a few stars are peeking through. If it's daytime, imagine those same stars lingering just beyond the blue, waiting patiently for their turn to appear. Someone thousands of years ago may have stood under that very same patch of sky and used it to decide when to put seeds in the ground or when to begin a journey. Those same points of light could have been the guide for someone raising a monument we still walk past today, one we haven't fully understood in purpose or meaning. If you enjoy letting your thoughts wander through questions like this, questions that unfold slowly and don't insist on fast answers, I'd truly appreciate it if you tapped like on this video or chose to subscribe. It helps this small, quiet corner of reflection find other people who might want to drift through the past in the same unhurried way. When you call history to mind, you might see it as a straight line, with events set out neatly in order like beads on a string. There's a clear beginning, there's some kind of end, and everything in between links together in one tidy, logical chain. But that's just one way to picture it. Another way is to think of history as a stack of translucent images. The top layer is the one we recognize, the famous empires, the well-known inventions, the great migrations and turning points. But beneath that familiar layer could be others we've hardly even noticed. One of those hidden layers might belong to a civilization older than we usually dare to imagine. A culture that developed skills and knowledge that filtered quietly into our world, passed from person to person, town to town, until any trace of where they started was gone. You can see the faint outline of this possibility in certain ruins. There are places where specialists agree the main visible structure belongs to a known culture, yet the platform or base beneath it, the foundation stones, don't quite match. Sometimes the lowest blocks are vastly larger than anything the later builders are known to have used. Sometimes they're fitted so exactly, without any mortar at all, that you can't slip even the thinnest blade between them. Above them, the more recent work can look almost clumsy in comparison. One straightforward explanation is that later builders simply repurposed old stones that were already there, left over from whoever had built before. And if that's the case, it means those earlier builders were present long before we have any names or written labels to attach to them. This pattern isn't confined to a single place. It appears in widely separated regions. You find walls where one section is made of neat, uniformly shaped blocks, while another section nearby consists of enormous, irregular stones locked together like a puzzle. You see cities where stacked layers of construction don't quite line up in style or material. Every time, the same question lingers quietly in the background. Who put down the very first stones? Before writing existed, the only way to keep knowledge alive was to speak it. Each time a story was retold, it had a chance to bend a little. Without written records, just a few generations could pass, and a major event could slide from clear memory into a hazy tale. From there, it could shift into legend, and then into pure myth, until the real people and real events were completely hidden under layers of embellishment and imagination. Archaeology is forced to work with what manages to survive, and survival is anything but fair. One object might rest underground for thousands of years without much damage, while something made at the same time dissolves or crumbles away because it was crafted from less durable stuff. If a civilization mainly built from wood in a rainy, humid region, their homes and meeting places might have simply melted back into soil. If they wrote their words on materials that burned easily or decayed quickly, those voices would be lost to us, so we're left holding fragments. Sometimes those fragments refuse to fit into the timeline we think we already understand. A tool may look too sophisticated for the era it's dated to. A particular construction technique might appear long before we expect to see it. When this happens, scholars have to make a choice. They can try to tuck the new find into the existing framework. They can argue that the dating process must have gone wrong, or they can put the anomaly aside in a special drawer labeled unexplained and move on. But every stray object, every puzzling structure, has a real story of origin. And in some of those stories, the trail might lead back to people we haven't officially met yet. If such a civilization once existed, it might not have been a massive empire with sprawling capitals. It could have been made up of relatively small groups scattered over wide distances, connected not by flags or borders, but by the exchange of ideas. Instead of pouring their energy into conquering territory, they might have focused on perfecting navigation, refining agriculture, charting the heavens, or crafting tools. They may have shared their discoveries in ways that allowed other cultures to adopt them as if they were their own. Their impact might have been almost invisible. Perhaps they traded seeds that became the foundation for staple crops we still depend on every day. Maybe they taught others how to shape stone so that it would endure the centuries. Maybe they demonstrated ways to mark the turning of seasons, or track the paths of stars that later became folded into religious ceremonies or traditional observances. When you really think about it, influence doesn't need to carry a name tag in order to last. You might reach for a tool several times a day without having the slightest idea who first invented that design. You might follow a holiday ritual or family custom without ever knowing where it truly began. Stretch that kind of nameless influence across thousands of years, and it's not hard to imagine an entire civilization fading from memory while its fingerprints remain all over the world. We also have to face how much of our own planet still hasn't been examined in any detail. Immense areas of the ocean floor remain unmapped. Thick jungle can conceal ancient structures even from the sharp eyes of satellites. Deserts have swallowed entire cities beneath waves of sand. Even in regions we think of as well-studied, unexpected things still turn up. Sometimes a road crew cuts into the soil and reveals an old wall just below the surface. Sometimes an extended drought lowers a reservoir, and the outlines of buildings appear on the exposed lakebed. Every time something like that happens, it reminds us that we're still only skimming the surface of our own story. It's entirely possible that we've already walked directly over or sailed right past the remains of such a civilization without realizing what we were looking at. Without the right context, a carefully shaped structure might be dismissed as nothing more than an odd rock outcrop. A stone carved by human hands might be written off as a natural coincidence. An unusual artifact might be cataloged as out of place, and then tucked away in a museum basement where few people will ever see it. The scale of what physically remains depends heavily on how those people lived. If they tended to move periodically, rather than settle in one spot for centuries, they might not have surrounded themselves with monumental architecture. If they later blended into other societies, Their distinct artistic style or building habits might have been absorbed and diluted until they no longer stand out. If they favored materials that break down easily, wood, fiber, clay, plant-based dyes, then nearly everything they crafted could be gone, apart from the rare object that was buried by accident or preserved by some stroke of luck. This is the point where the idea shifts from idle daydream to something that changes how we think about progress itself. We like to picture human knowledge climbing steadily upward over time, each generation stacking new insight on top of the last. But the record shows us that knowledge can slide backward. Skills vanish when no one has a reason or the opportunity to teach them. Entire specialties can disappear within a few lifetimes. If there was an early peak somewhere far back in our story, followed by a long decline, then later cultures may have slowly rebuilt pieces of that lost knowledge without ever realizing they were rebuilding. That possibility can transform how our surroundings feel. It suggests that something as mundane as the curve of a road could follow a path first laid out by people who vanished long before recorded history got started. It suggests that a farming method in one corner of the world might trace its roots to a place thousands of miles away, carried by hands whose names we'll never know. And once you start looking at the world through that lens, you begin to spot odd echoes everywhere. A symbol carved into stone in one country looks almost identical to a symbol found far away across land and sea. A particular woodworking joint appears in traditions that supposedly never touched one another. A bedtime story told to children in one language carries almost the exact same shape as a story told elsewhere, with only the names and small details shifted. Any one of these overlaps could be the result of separate people solving similar problems in similar ways. Of course that happens. Our brains share the same basic wiring, but sometimes the match is too precise to shrug off. When the parallels line up a bit too neatly and they turn up in places that currently have no documented connection, it opens the door to another possibility, that someone made those connections a very long time ago. And perhaps they left more behind than we've had the eyes or tools to detect so far. Maybe the next truly important discovery won't be a massive stone complex or a chest of gold, but some simple, ordinary object that quietly forces us to redraw entire timelines. When you start scanning for patterns like these, you notice that many of the oldest features of our world don't make a lot of noise. They don't announce themselves like skyscrapers or neon signs. They speak softly. They allow the wind, rain, and sun to blur their edges. They sink into the landscape until it becomes hard to tell whether you're looking at something people created or just the patient work of water and time. Ironically, that's often what allows them to last. Think about the way a story can linger in a family. Maybe your grandparents passed down something they heard from theirs, and in the passing, details started to slip. A name here or there might fall away. A distant location might be swapped with someplace more familiar. An ordinary figure could be exaggerated into a hero. By the time the story gets to you, it feels like it lives halfway between memory and dream. Yet, beneath all the extras, there's usually a small, solid kernel of truth. The same kind of quiet distortion happens to the memory of whole cultures. Without writing, the main way to carry history forward was to turn it into spoken narrative, to shape it into something memorable enough that people would want to repeat it. And the simplest way to make something memorable is to add drama. Make the central figures larger than life. Let the events grow bigger, stranger, more intense. Add a touch of danger here, a bit of romance there. Turn it into something worth retelling by the fire. The problem is that as the story becomes more engaging, the details that were once simple facts begin to bend. Over many centuries, an entirely human leader can stretch into a legendary ruler who reigned for hundreds of years. A skilled navigator becomes someone who can command the wind and waves. A city built through patient labor and planning becomes a place raised overnight by unseen forces. What started as straightforward history is absorbed into a shared mythology. And once that happens, people eventually stop asking whether any part of it really took place. This is where the whisper tends to hide, not in the obviously impossible parts, but in the oddly practical details. that don't need any magic to work yet feel strangely advanced for their supposed time. Details like knowing exactly when the rainy season will break, or being able to predict an eclipse, or building in a way that lets a structure endure for hundreds of years without collapsing. Those small, grounded fragments may be all that's left of real knowledge passed down from people who were gone long before the storytellers knew their names. Some researchers devote entire careers to sifting through myths and legends for these practical threads. They compare tales from distant regions, searching for similarities that really shouldn't be there if the stories grew in isolation. When two cultures separated by oceans tell nearly the same version of a great flood, it's easy to brush it off at first. Floods happen nearly everywhere, after all. But when the descriptions line up closely how it started, how people survived, what the world looked like afterward, the coincidence becomes harder to wave away. The same pattern appears in stories about strange visitors, sudden leaps in technology, and cities that disappear beneath the ocean. In some traditions, there are tales of beings who arrive from far away, share essential skills, and then leave just as quietly. Sometimes they're framed as gods, sometimes as wise wanderers. Sometimes they're barely described at all, only marked as different from everyone else. These accounts might be pure invention, or they might be very old, very faint memories of contact with groups who held knowledge others hadn't yet developed. There's also the curious way certain symbols show up in places that, by our current understanding, should never have influenced one another. Spirals, for instance, appear in ancient art from Ireland, in rock carvings in the American Southwest, and in the designs of islands scattered across the Pacific. Maybe the spiral is simply a shape that human minds are drawn to. It echoes shells, whirlpools, storms, galaxies. But there's another possibility, that the symbol itself traveled along old paths, carried from one culture to another, generation after generation. Even language can hold traces of forgotten contact. A single word in one tongue can have a surprising twin in a distant language, spoken thousands of miles away, with a meaning that hasn't drifted much at all. Sometimes linguists can explain this through known trade routes, migrations, or conquests. Other times the link is fuzzier, harder to trace. If a now-lost civilization once traveled widely, teaching, trading, or settling briefly in many places, fragments of their speech could have embedded themselves in local vocabularies. Those fragments might still be there today, disguised as familiar words no one realizes came from somewhere much older. We also catch whispers in the layout of ancient sites. Some align with extraordinary precision to the paths of the sun, moon, or certain stars. In a few cases, the alignment is so exact that even modern engineers and astronomers pause to take notice. How did people armed only with rudimentary tools manage that level of accuracy? Sometimes, with enough study, we uncover clever, low-tech methods that explain it. Other times, the puzzle remains. And in those moments of uncertainty, it becomes tempting to wonder whether the knowledge came from another source, someone who had already mapped the sky in detail. The difficulty is that for every intriguing clue, there are many more everyday explanations. An unusual artifact might turn out to be a creative experiment by a known culture. A shared symbol could have been invented independently. A story about a vanished city might turn out to be a metaphor for social or spiritual change rather than a literal place. So the idea of an unknown civilization remains just that, an idea, unless enough separate pieces fall into place to create a picture that's more than speculation. Still, the number of odd, unexplained pieces grows slowly over time. Every year, fresh discoveries press against our timelines. A settlement turns out to be thousands of years older than anyone expected. A tool appears in a layer where it shouldn't by rights exist. A genetic study hints at contact between populations that were thought to have remained isolated. These are not fantasies. They are documented shifts in our understanding brought on by stubborn evidence that forces historians and archaeologists to adjust the story. You might assume that this means we're steadily closing in on a complete account. But the opposite often seems true. The more we learn, the more we become aware of how much lies outside our grasp. Each answer opens the door to several new questions. How was this accomplished? Why is that there? Where did those people go? Sometimes the explanation may be relatively straightforward. Maybe they never truly vanished at all. Maybe they slowly merged with the cultures that followed, losing their distinct name but leaving their knowledge alive and active. In other cases, something more dramatic might have happened. Floods, quakes, or disease wiping out most of a population and leaving only a handful of survivors unable to maintain the same level of complexity. And then there's a stranger possibility, that they chose to step away from history as we record it. Perhaps they moved on from their own centers of power by design. Perhaps they concealed parts of their presence, believing that it would be safer or more meaningful for those who came after to think they had developed certain skills and ideas on their own. It's difficult to picture why any society would consciously allow its memory to erode. But even in our more recent past, there are hints that sometimes people walk away from what they've built. We know of cities from familiar cultures that were abandoned without signs of war or catastrophe. The buildings were left standing. The water system still worked for a time, yet the people simply left. If an unknown civilization once did something similar, their only lasting record might be the things they made and left behind. And if they truly did not want to be remembered, they might have made that record very hard to see. What's striking about this idea is how it changes our sense of what we think we already know. It suggests that what we treat as the beginning of a culture's story could actually be the middle chapter. It suggests that some of the great leaps forward we celebrate might have been steps back toward knowledge that was once common and then forgotten. It suggests that myths we hold as entertainment or metaphor might be guarding fragments of real events. If any of that is true, then every ruined wall, every half-buried tool, every odd word tucked into an old language becomes more than just a curious detail. It becomes a piece of a much wider puzzle. When we imagine puzzles, we tend to picture all the pieces gathered in one box just waiting to be assembled. But history doesn't work like that. Most of the pieces are scattered. Some are missing entirely. Some are sitting in the wrong box, labeled as something they're not. Others are so worn down that it's almost impossible to tell what they once were. The whisper that comes before history is like the faded picture on the outside of a puzzle box that's been left in the sun too long. You can still make out hints of shapes, maybe a faint patch of color, but nowhere near enough to feel sure of the final image. And yet, that faint outline still exists. The question is whether we're willing to look closely enough to see it at all, and whether we're prepared for the possibility that the scene we uncover is nothing like the one we thought we were putting together. Sometimes the question arrives without any warning. You might be standing in a museum in front of an object so old it's hard to accept that human hands ever touched it. Or you might be walking past a worn stone in some quiet field. A stone that looks just a little too intentional when the thought drifts in. Who was here before us? Not just before our immediate ancestors, but before the people we label as the first farmers, the first sailors, the first builders of cities. Who helped set the path before written records began to keep track? Most of the time, we answer that question by reaching for what we've been taught. We recite the list of the earliest named civilizations, the people of Mesopotamia, the dynasties along the Nile, the communities of the Indus Valley, the early states of China. We picture the first city walls going up, the first boats leaving sheltered inlets for open water, the first tools of metal replacing stone. But that story is built only from what survived once we started writing things down. It's the record after the record starts. It doesn't mean nothing of importance happened in the long stretch before. Again and again, archaeology has shown us that the human story runs deeper into the past than we once assumed. There was a period when the idea of people raising complex monuments thousands of years before Egypt's pyramids was considered unimaginable. Then we found those places sites older than the Great Tombs by millennia, built with levels of organization and skill that seemed out of reach for what we used to call simple societies. Each time the clock is pushed back, the gap between our expectations and the evidence seems to widen. But there's another layer lurking below the question. It's not just about when humans first began doing certain things. It's about whether there were entire, organized, complex, surprisingly capable civilizations that rose and fell before the cultures we recognize by name, societies whose titles, stories, and leaders never made it into any script because they were gone before anyone started keeping lists. If that sounds like a stretch, consider how quickly even our modern world could fade if no one maintained it. Stop fixing a road and weather starts to crack it within years. Leave buildings empty, and in just a few decades they begin to sag and crumble. Let a few centuries pass without repairs, and even the tallest structures can break down into heaps of stone, metal, and dust. After 1,000 years with no one to preserve anything, much of what we take for granted could vanish almost completely. Now imagine the same process unfolding not over centuries but over tens of thousands of years. If a civilization built mostly in wood, clay, and other fragile materials, especially in a climate that speeds decay, nearly all evidence of its cities and tools could dissolve. If they did use stone for some key works, pieces might survive, but without context, we might misdate them or assume their natural formations. We tend to underestimate how delicate the trail of human presence really is. Fire, floods, quakes, volcanoes, rising seas. All of these have wiped out entire communities and landscapes. Places that once held thriving towns are now drowned beneath the ocean. Areas that were once lush and green have turned into deserts, burying any remains under layers of sand. In such regions, the work of whoever came first may be sitting just beyond our reach, waiting for erosion or shifting water levels to lift the veil. Even without natural forces, there's another powerful agent of erasure: us. Later societies frequently build right on top of earlier ones, scavenging stone and timber, reshaping foundations, and covering older layers with new streets and walls. When you stroll through an ancient city today, your feet might be resting on the ghosts of something far older than anything you can see. If we accept that this is even possible, the question becomes even more compelling. What if some of the breakthroughs we credit to familiar civilizations were actually inheritances? Maybe they didn't dream up every major idea from nothing. Maybe some concepts arrived as faint hand-me-downs from a much earlier people. That kind of inheritance doesn't need to be a formal lesson. When people travel, trade, or migrate, they carry their skills with them. They might teach intentionally. Others might simply watch and learn. Over a few generations, everyone forgets there was ever a first teacher. The ability just becomes how things are done. That leads us to another puzzle: knowledge that seems to arrive before its time. Every now and then we find signs that people were accomplishing feats far ahead of what we thought was feasible for that era. They might be building with extraordinary precision when our models say they had only very basic tools. They might be navigating across long distances in ways we didn't believe they could. They might be demonstrating an understanding of astronomy or engineering that appears to belong to a much later stage. Sometimes, with enough digging, we uncover methods that explain these feats and realize we simply underestimated ancient ingenuity. But other times, the explanations that are offered feel a bit strained. In those cases, it's easy to default to saying it's all coincidence, or that our dating methods must be flawed. The more challenging but more intriguing possibility is that those people were drawing from a reservoir of knowledge that wasn't originally their own, that they were continuing a tradition instead of inventing it fresh. Oral histories sometimes hint at this. Across many regions, you find stories about learning from outsiders, strangers who arrive from distant lands or across the sea, share an important technique, and then depart. In some accounts, they're divine. In others, they're remarkable, but human. The details shift with culture and time, but the pattern is similar. Someone comes, teaches something transformative, and disappears. These stories are not hard proof of anything on their own. Yet when similar tales appear in places that supposedly had no contact with each other, it suggests the possibility that they're echoing the same kind of event, even if the names and imagery have changed. We also have to look closely at the gaps in our record. For every ancient site that's been uncovered and studied, there are many more that remain hidden. Jungle can swallow stone pathways and pyramids whole. Sand can roll over towns. Ice can bury settlements that once sat in milder climates. Rising seas can claim entire shorelines in a handful of generations. Some of these lost places will eventually be brought to light, as has happened before with lost cities reappearing under brush or silt. Others may never be accessible. But the fact that they exist at all means our current story is drawn from only a sliver of the full picture. If that's the case, then wondering who came before us isn't just a poetic indulgence. It's a real question with weight. Whoever they were, their choices helped shape the ground we stand on. They may not have seen themselves as exceptional. They might have simply been living their lives solving daily problems, assembling shelters, inventing small conveniences, raising children. But the answers they found, where to settle, what to plant, how to handle the landscape, could echo quietly across thousands of years. If an earlier civilization domesticated a plant that later became a primary food source, we might be eating from their legacy every time we sit down to a meal. If they perfected a particular way of cutting and joining stone, later masons could have copied it without ever knowing who first figured it out. If they tracked the stars and seasons with precision, their observations might have been folded seamlessly into the astronomy of later cultures. Looked at this way, asking who came before us is not only about unearthing ruins or displaying artifacts. It's about recognizing the subtle, persistent ways influence moves through time. It's about acknowledging that our past may be longer and more intricate than we currently think, and that somewhere back in that deep, unseen stretch might have been people whose fingerprints are still on our reality, even if the world has forgotten to say their names. Before we wander further down that path, I'd like to ask you for something small, something simple, and something that helps keep this kind of journey alive. If this slow drift through questions that don't demand quick conclusions feels right to you, if you enjoy stepping outside what's written in textbooks and walking through possibilities, it would genuinely help if you liked this video or chose to subscribe. On the surface, it's a tiny gesture, but behind the scenes, it matters more than it seems. It allows this quiet little space to be noticed by others who might also want to think about the past without being rushed. I'm not bringing it up, because numbers here matter in the same way they do in most corners of the internet. I'm mentioning it because the more minds we have gathered around the same set of questions, the richer the conversation can become. Each extra person adds another angle, another experience, another story. Often it's a short comment from someone halfway around the world that shifts how you see something you thought you already understood. Sometimes it's hearing from someone who has lived near an old site all their life and has seen things that never end up in formal research. And sometimes it's simply that quiet reassurance that you're not alone in liking questions that don't need to be tied up with a neat answer at the end. There's a kind of comfort in knowing that other people are moving through this same moment with you, even if you'll never meet them. Right now, someone might be listening from a high-rise apartment with traffic buzzing below the window. Someone else might be in a small town where the night air is still enough that you can hear crickets or wind moving through trees. Somewhere, another person might be starting their morning with a cup of coffee while you're letting the day go. We've been talking about people who came before us, lives that bent the world into the shape we know today without us realizing it. That same kind of ripple exists right now in the present. What you decide to pass along, who you discuss these ideas with, what questions you repeat. Those choices can shift how someone else sees the same subject. Pressing a button to like or subscribe might feel like nothing more than another interaction with a screen, but really it's the smallest step in a chain of events you can't fully follow. It's the modern version of adding your voice to a long conversation around a fire. You sit down, you listen, maybe you speak up once, and someone new who's just arrived hears a thought for the first time. And since we're already picturing that firelight, it's worth remembering that for most of human history, that's how knowledge moved. There were no long recordings, no searchable archives, only living voices sharing with other living voices. If you wanted to be part of the exchange, you had to show up and pay attention. And simply by being there, you became part of its memory. In a way, that's what's happening now as you stay with a conversation like this. You're here. You're listening. And in doing so, you're helping to keep an idea alive. Maybe you've always been drawn to history and deep time. Maybe you're intrigued by the thought that our past could be more layered than we're usually told. Maybe you just appreciate the pace, the chance to slow down and think about something bigger than today's list of tasks. All of those reasons fit comfortably here. What's interesting is that when people gather around topics like this, the questions they ask often spill over into the present. Once you accept that unknown civilizations might have nudged our world in subtle ways, you start to notice subtle influences happening all around you in real time. You begin to see how certain ideas spread, how new practices travel from one small community to another, and eventually become normal almost everywhere. Perhaps there's a habit you have right now that came from a source you've never thought to trace. Maybe you cook something the way your parents did, not realizing they learned it from theirs, and so on, continuing backward further than anyone now alive can remember. Maybe you listen to a style of music that has crossed borders and cultures over decades, changing shape each time before it landed in your headphones. The same is true for technology. Whatever device you're using at this moment is built on layers of effort from more people than anyone could easily list. Engineers, inventors, laborers, thinkers, tinkerers, most of whose names will never appear in a history book. That's part of why conversations like this can matter. When we open ourselves to the possibility that much of our world rests on foundations laid by people we've forgotten, we also become more aware of the invisible contributions being made right now. We realize that the present isn't an isolated moment. It's another link in a very long chain. And what we do, as ordinary as it may feel, will become part of someone else's starting point. There's a reason I'm bringing all of this up before diving further into specific mysteries. Once we begin getting into artifacts, sites, and theories, it's easy to get pulled into just the details. Those are important, but they're easier to understand when you already have a sense of how influence can move quietly across time. When you've seen it at work on a small scale in your own life, it becomes easier to imagine it operating over centuries or millennia. An influence doesn't need to be grand to endure. A single tool design, if it works better than whatever came before, can outlast its original maker by thousands of years. A way of stacking stones that makes walls stronger can be copied by builders who never know who first came up with it. A story that encourages people to treat one another differently can survive long after the specific reason it was first told is forgotten. I think about that a lot when I look at ancient ruins. I find myself wondering not only who raised them, but whether those builders ever thought about us, the distant future, at all. Did they imagine their work might last this long? Did they intend it? Or were they just responding to immediate needs? Maybe the survival of what they made doesn't depend on what they meant to do. Maybe the same is true of us now. The ideas you share or the habits you pass down might last longer than you ever expect, regardless of whether you planned it that way. So yes, on the surface I'm asking you for something tiny, but I'm also pointing out that small actions often belong to much bigger stories. If you've ever heard someone talk about planting a seed, you know the image. You do something modest today that may grow into something much larger later. The catch is that you rarely, if ever, see the full result. But that doesn't make it any less real. That's how I think about this kind of conversation. Each time we have it, it's like placing a seed into the soil of someone's mind. Each person who hears it may carry something different away. Some might share it immediately with someone else. Others might let it sit quietly in the background until it clicks with another idea years from now. Some will set it aside and barely think of it again until something down the line brings it back. There's no way to script or control that process, but it's always in motion. And now that you've come along this far, you're part of it. Whether you just dropped in, or you've been listening for a while, you've stepped into a moment that connects you with all the other times this conversation has played out. The people who stumble upon it in the future will be connected to you too, even if none of you ever know it. In that sense, it's not unlike how we relate to those unknown civilizations we've been considering. We don't know their faces or their voices, but we move through a world their decisions helped sculpt. Their names have faded, but the results of their choices might be all around us, hidden in plain sight. In the same way, you may never meet everyone who listens to this, but you share a space with them. Not a physical room, but a shared stretch of thought, the way we all share this planet with the countless lives that came before. So if you'd like to add your voice in the smallest, lightest way, you already know how. And once that's out of the way, we can turn more fully toward the trail itself. The scattered clues, the recurring oddities, the unanswered questions that might bring us closer to knowing whether such a civilization ever truly existed. When we first set out to look for the past, we like to imagine it as something clean and orderly. In our heads, the archaeological record becomes a tidy archive, where each event and culture is filed exactly where it belongs. But the reality is closer to rummaging through a box of broken, mismatched pieces. Most of what was ever made is missing. Much of what remains is out of context. Some fragments are so damaged that we can barely tell what they used to be. The narratives we build from those scraps are always partial, always provisional, stitched together from whatever information happens to be available right now. That means there are shadows in the story places where something clearly happened. But the evidence has failed to survive. There are gaps where we see sudden changes without being able to explain the steps in between. There are contradictions where one set of findings seems to argue with another. The record of the Earth isn't just what we dig up. It's also the empty spaces where we know something must be missing. And when you start paying attention to those empty spaces, you begin to see patterns. Sometimes the pattern is geographic. Huge regions have barely been examined, either because they're hard to reach, or because human concerns, borders, politics, funding, conflict have kept research away. Large swaths of the seabed haven't been mapped in any detail. Thick forests hide potential ruins under their canopy. Deserts bury whole settlements beneath dunes. Mountain valleys may hold traces of communities no one has had the chance to study. In all of those overlooked places, there's always a chance that something lies waiting that would force us to rewrite parts of the story. Sometimes, the pattern is about time rather than space. There are stretches in the timeline where physical evidence thins out, even though there's no reason to think that people weren't present and active. We might find a few tools or fragments of pottery from that era, but nothing that tells us much about how people were organized, what they believed, or how they lived day to day. And then, there are the oddities. An artifact surfaces in a layer of soil that seems far older than the object should be. A construction method shows up long before we think it was developed. A piece of technology appears in a context where, by our best estimates, it shouldn't exist yet. These finds are often called out-of-place artifacts. Many of them eventually get sensible explanations, disturbed layers, later intrusion, innocent misinterpretation, but a subset of them stays stubborn and strange, refusing to fit neatly into the accepted narrative. In the most cautious parts of the field, those anomalies tend to be kept at arm's length. They're not necessarily dismissed, but they're not allowed to overturn major ideas on their own. And that's reasonable. One strange find isn't enough to rewrite everything. But if enough of these anomalies start appearing, and if they begin to form their own pattern, they stop being isolated curiosities and start looking like signals that something in our picture is incomplete. There are fairly well-known examples of discoveries that did exactly that. Sites later found to be thousands of years older than first thought. Tools that show advanced craftsmanship at unexpectedly early dates. Human remains that suggest our ancestors were present in a region long before we believed they were. Each time such a discovery holds up under scrutiny, the reaction follows a familiar sequence. Surprise, debate. Then, slowly, the incorporation of the new evidence into the broader story. What's less often talked about is the gray zone before that acceptance. Before the shift becomes official, there's a period where the discovery hangs in limbo. Some scholars advocate for it, others argue against. During that in-between time, speculation thrives. This is one of the spaces where the idea of an unknown civilization slips into view, because if there's a cluster of advanced techniques or unexpected artifacts emerging too early or in the wrong places, one possible explanation, though not the only one, is that they came from a source we haven't identified yet. a source that may have been more accomplished than we expect for that age. It's important to remember that the version of history we carry around is built almost entirely from what has survived, and survival is extremely uneven. Objects last longer if they're made of stone or certain metals, if they're buried quickly in particular kinds of soil, if they remain in dry or frozen environments. A stone building in a desert might last for thousands of years. A wooden one in a warm, wet forest might rot away in a few decades. If a civilization favored materials that don't preserve well, almost everything they made could vanish. Even when their work does endure, it can be hard to recognize. An ancient quarry might look like a natural cliff face to someone who doesn't know the signs. The remnants of a settlement can be mistaken for random stones. Earthen mounds might be read as hills rather than human-made shapes. Only when someone with the right tools and background looks closely do these features begin to speak as human creations. And even then, their purpose often remains fuzzy. We can measure and date a structure's stones, but that doesn't automatically tell us whether it served as a place of worship, a storage building, a fortress, a calendar, or something we haven't even thought of. Without writing or clear accompanying artifacts, we're forced to interpret its use based on parallels we've seen elsewhere. If this site doesn't line up with those parallels, we move into the realm of educated guesswork. That uncertain space is part of why so many shadows linger around the edges of our understanding. If we're not sure what we're looking at, it's harder to integrate it into any larger narrative. It might remain labeled as an isolated oddity when it actually belongs to a wider, mostly invisible network. There's also the human reality behind all this research. Archaeology doesn't happen in a neutral vacuum. It's shaped by where funding is available, what questions are considered respectable, which regions are safe or politically accessible, and what technologies exist at the time. Some sites are explored intensely because they're easy to reach or because they fit neatly into known historical frameworks. Others are glanced at and then set aside because they're remote, dangerous, or don't obviously connect to existing stories. The result is an archaeological record that isn't just incomplete, it's uneven. Some periods and places are overrepresented, others barely show up at all. In those underexplored segments, whether they're gaps in geography or in time, the remains of people we've never heard of could be sitting quietly, waiting for someone to notice them. Every so often, a single discovery gives us a glimpse of that possibility. A structure built using methods that seem beyond what we'd expect for its supposed builders. An artifact made from material that must have come from very far away, hinting at trade networks we didn't know existed at that point. A recurring pattern in where settlements are placed that suggests a shared understanding of resources or defense that doesn't match what we've assumed. Each of these hints can be brushed aside when viewed alone, but as they start to cluster, when the same kinds of puzzles appear in different places and times, they become harder to ignore. That's when the shadows begin to suggest shapes. Not solid, conclusive forms, but suggestions. You can think of it like staring at a photograph where parts of the image are blurred. You can't make out all the details. But you can sometimes tell that something is there. A figure, a structure, a landscape, before you can name it. The most difficult part is that we don't know how big those blurred areas are. They might represent a few isolated communities that have slipped through the cracks. Or they might conceal complex civilizations that rose, flourished, and faded before we ever learned their names. Without more evidence, we can't say. Yet with every new artifact lifted from the ground, every newly surveyed site, every test result that comes back with an unexpected date, we gain one more fragment. Sometimes it slots smoothly into place. Sometimes it forces us to adjust the big picture. And sometimes it sits to one side, not quite fitting until much later, when another discovery suddenly gives it meaning. That potential, that today's stray piece might be tomorrow's key, is what keeps people searching. Because even though the archaeological record is made of what we can hold and measure, it's equally shaped by the things we know must be missing. And those shadows, as frustrating as they can be, may be pointing us toward a story much larger than the one we tell now. If written records are the clear, speaking voice of history, then stone is its older, quieter language. Stones don't lay out events in sentences. They don't tell you names or dates directly. They can't interrupt you if you misread them. But they carry their own grammar and patterns of shaping, in the ways they're stacked or aligned, in their scale, and in the directions they face. Sometimes, this language is easy to interpret. We find inscriptions carved in scripts we can read, allowing us to translate them and compare them with other texts. When that happens, we gain direct access to what the builders wanted remembered. Far more often, though, the stones say nothing in any alphabet we recognize. There are no clear letters or numbers, no inscriptions we can tie to known systems. In those cases, the only way to read them is to study the work itself, the choices made in carving, the methods used to move and set the blocks, the relationships between the stones and their surroundings, whether that means a river, a mountain, or the rising point of the sun. Even the plainest looking stone can say something if you look closely. A groove worn into it might reveal where a tool was dragged again and again. The shape and spacing of chisel marks can tell you whether the workers used stone, bronze, or iron. The kind of rock itself can reveal its source, sometimes a quarry many miles away. When you string together those details, the outlines of the builder's knowledge begin to appear. If the surfaces are flawlessly level and the blocks fit so snugly that you can't slide a sheet of paper between them, it shows an impressive command of measurement and cutting. If enormous stones were moved and raised into place, it implies that those people knew ways of handling weight that would still challenge us today without careful planning. This is where things get especially interesting if we're considering an unknown civilization. At some sites, the stonework at the base appears to be far more advanced than the construction sitting above it. The lowest layers are made of massive blocks fitted with astonishing precision, while the upper portions, clearly from a later period, are rougher and less exact. In such places, some researchers suggest that the recognized culture reused older foundations. It's as if they found the remains of sturdy work from a previous era and decided to build on top of it. Temples perch on platforms that seem too old for the people we've credited with the construction. Isolated blocks carved with skill lie far from any identified quarry, as though they were once part of a larger whole that has since vanished. On some stones, we find marks that don't match any known writing. They might be symbolic, decorative, or functional guidelines for workers. Without context, it's hard to be sure. In some cases, very similar markings turn up at far apart locations, hinting at either a shared tradition or a common origin. Alignment is another key part of this stone language. Many ancient structures are oriented towards specific points on the horizon, places where the sun or moon rises or sets during solstices and equinoxes. Others appear to line up with particular stars or constellations as they appeared at certain times in the far past. These alignments show a clear understanding of the sky's rhythms and of how to translate those observations into built form. They also tell us that tracking celestial patterns was important enough to be built into the very bones of these monuments. What's remarkable is how accurate some of these alignments are. Achieving them requires not only careful, long-term watching, but also the ability to convert angular measurements into physical layouts. If you're already imagining a small, early civilization with refined skills in this area, it becomes easier to picture how their techniques could have filtered into other cultures, even long after they themselves were gone. It's also possible that stones were reused again and again. A later group might come upon an abandoned complex, remove nicely cut blocks, and incorporate them into their own buildings. That process can scramble the original sentences written in stone, mixing periods and styles. For those trying to read the language later, it's like trying to decode a paragraph made from phrases cut out of different books. To untangle that, some specialists focus on the traces left by tools. By analyzing the depth, spacing, and shape of marks on stone surfaces, they can sometimes identify which tools were used, and by extension, what kind of technology the builders had. If a site contains marks consistent with metal tools at a time and place where we don't think metal was being used yet, it raises uncomfortable questions. Did the builders have more advanced tools than we've assumed? Did they reuse stones left by an earlier group with better technology? Or are our dates for the site off? Then there are the more dramatic mysteries. Huge blocks weighing tens or even hundreds of tons, apparently quarried, transported, and set without the aid of machines. Stones carved into curves and complex shapes that would challenge modern craftsmen working on site. Surfaces polished to near-mirror smoothness with methods we don't fully understand. There's no need to leap to the wildest explanations to be impressed by these feats. Even within the range of what humans can accomplish with enough determination and cooperation, some of these works require a level of planning and technical sophistication that stands out. If a now-vanished culture specialized in such work, the most durable parts of their creations could have outlived their memory, eventually being adopted and built upon by others. Stones also carry clues in how they've weathered. Patterns of erosion can sometimes suggest how long they've been exposed to the elements, though this kind of dating is tricky and debated. When a structure's weathering seems out of step with its supposed age, it might hint at greater antiquity, or at the reuse of older materials. Another subtle line of evidence lies in construction style. Certain ways of fitting stones together appear in multiple regions that weren't supposed to be connected at the time. For example, massive polygonal walls, made of many-sided blocks locked tightly without mortar, are found in the Andes, and also in parts of the Mediterranean. Whether this is a case of independent invention, shared influence, or something else, remains a matter of debate. We also have to grapple with the fact that stones often don't stay where they were originally placed. Earthquakes can topple structures, floods can move blocks, human hands can dismantle one building to create another. By the time we discover the remains, what we see may be a jumbled aftermath rather than the original design. Reading meaning into that can be like trying to understand a book after most of the pages have been blown out of order. In many cases, the stones are all we have. No writing, no clear iconography, no direct explanations. We can't ask them questions, but we can measure, test, and compare. They can tell us what was physically possible in a given place, and what the builders valued enough to pour labor into. They can hint at shared traditions spread across distance and time. Occasionally, a single carved block on its own might seem unremarkable, just another piece of worked rock. But if matching blocks appear hundreds of miles away with similar style and tool marks, a connection begins to emerge. That connection could indicate trade, migration, or a common cultural ancestor. The difficulty is that stone, by lasting so long, often becomes separated from the rest of its world. Whatever wood, cloth, or metal once surrounded it has usually vanished. We're left with single words from a language whose grammar we can only guess. Learning to read those words demands patience and an acceptance that some meanings may remain forever partial. But occasionally, a pattern reveals itself, a distinctive way of shaping corners, a consistent type of joint, a repeated astronomical alignment, and it allows us to link one site to another. In those moments, it can feel as if we've managed to hear a few extra syllables of that ancient language of stone. When we think about maps, we usually picture something relatively modern: paper charts, glowing screens, tidy outlines of coastlines and borders. Maps feel like products of a time when people could measure distance precisely and record it in detail. Yet here and there, we find early maps or objects that look very much like them, that seem to belong to ages before such precision was supposed to be possible. They don't resemble street maps in your phone, but they show relationships that require careful observation, repeated journeys, and a way to transmit that knowledge clearly to others. Some of these proto-maps are carved into rock, scratched onto clay, or painted on walls. Others survive only as descriptions in ancient texts that speak of lands far beyond what those writers were believed to know. There are maps that appear to show islands we didn't officially document until thousands of years later, or coastlines drawn in ways that match how those regions would have looked when sea levels were lower at the end of the last ice age. How information like that could have been gathered is a deep question. In some instances, chance or the gradual sharing of travelers' tales might account for the accuracy. But in other cases, the fit with modern geography is uncannily precise. Imagine the effort required for a culture without compasses, satellites, or aircraft to map out hundreds of miles of shore with that kind of detail. They would have had to explore repeatedly, record what they saw, and keep that knowledge stable across generations. One especially discussed example is a map from the early 1500s that seems to depict the coast of South America quite accurately, and also includes a landmass at the bottom resembling Antarctica, possibly shown without its ice. The mainstream interpretation is that this map was compiled from older charts, which themselves drew on even earlier sources. If that's so, then the question shifts. Instead of asking who made the 16th century map, we have to ask who first surveyed those distant coasts. There are also indigenous mapping traditions that predate contact with the European cartography and display impressive precision in their own right. Some Polynesian stick charts, for example, encode the positions of islands, currents, and wave patterns over huge areas of ocean. They don't look like Western maps, but they perform the same function, guiding navigators across areas with no landmarks. The knowledge required to make and understand those charts doesn't appear overnight. It has to be observed, tested, and handed down carefully. If such a tradition began earlier than we realize, it could mean vast stretches of the Pacific were effectively mapped by human memory and practiced long before outsiders arrived. Elsewhere, stone carvings in parts of Europe and the Near East show patterns that resemble local landscapes, rivers, hills, clusters of dwellings seen from above. We can't be absolutely sure that's what they are, but the resemblance invites that reading. It suggests that even without standardized symbols, people found ways to represent space and distance visually. The idea that maps can preserve knowledge far older than the parchment or stone they're written on is not far-fetched. A chart can be copied, altered, and recopied so many times that its original maker's identity is lost, even while important details survive. Over centuries, each copyist may add or lose something, but the basic outline of a coastline or the placement of a landmark can persist. This is where the idea of an unknown civilization fits in. If we uncover maps, or things map-like, that depict places in a level of detail or at a time that doesn't match our current timeline, one plausible explanation is that the data came from somewhere else, from a culture with the capability and motivation to gather it. Maybe that source was a seafaring society with wide horizons, or an inland power with skilled surveyors and a reason to chart distant territories. The difficulty is that maps are fragile. Unlike stone temples, most early maps were drawn on materials that don't last: leather, bark, cloth, early forms of paper. Unless they're protected under exceptional conditions, they disappear within a few centuries. That means for every early map we have, countless others have likely turned to dust. And yet bits of them can survive in indirect ways. A later scribe might copy an older map into a manuscript, preserving details he doesn't personally understand. A story might carefully describe a series of coastal features or islands in a particular order that, when laid against a modern map, lines up with real geography. Myths might speak of lands across the sea in ways that, taken literally, sound suspiciously like travel accounts. We can't treat every such similarity as proof, but we can't ignore the ones that align too consistently with known terrain. Another angle is that some ancient structures may function as maps in physical form. Arrangements of stones, mounds, or earthworks can mirror the shapes of constellations or sketch out regional layouts. In those cases, the map is three-dimensional and anchored to the ground. To walk it is to read it. Creating that kind of spatial representation implies both abstract thinking and a deliberate intention to preserve information over a very long period. It's also important to remember that even today, our map of the world has blank spots. Large areas of the ocean are only roughly charted. Some land regions have little detail beyond satellite imagery and sparse survey data. If a skilled navigational culture existed thousands of years ago, it's entirely possible they knew about coastlines, islands, or currents that modern explorers only rediscovered later. Not because they had modern machinery, but because they devoted generations to traveling and recording. Whether any of their original charts survive is another matter. The survival of a map depends not only on what it's made of, but on whether people see it as worth preserving. If a once crucial route falls out of use, or if a city that guarded its charts falls, those records can vanish. leaving only faint echoes in the documents of other cultures. If we ever do find a map that can be convincingly linked to a civilization not yet recognized by name, it probably won't come with a neat caption explaining who made it and why. More likely, it will be some small corner of a known chart, the outline of a shore, the position of an island, that doesn't match what we think the map maker should have known. Only when someone compares it patiently to modern data and realizes that the match is too good to be an accident will its implications fully emerge. And when that happens, the real story won't be about ink and parchment. It will be about journeys taken, coastlines traced, and knowledge carried over water by people whose names never made it into the surviving record. Myths have a way of outlasting almost everything. Details get swapped, characters change, settings migrate, but the structure of certain stories endures. A tale told in one era may be repeated in the next with slight adjustments, then again and again, until those telling it have no idea where it began. To them, it's simply part of how things are, a shared inheritance. For a long time, myths were seen mostly as entertainment or as primitive attempts to explain storms, eclipses, or the behavior of animals. They were often treated as evidence of what people didn't know, rather than as repositories of anything they did. But over the last century or so, more and more researchers have begun to treat myths like layered records. While they are not literal in every detail, they can preserve memories of real events, places, and people that predate writing. If you strip away the layers of symbolism, exaggeration, and moral framing, you sometimes find that a myth describes something that could have happened in the physical world. A story of a devastating flood, once you take out the universal scale and divine motives, may line up with evidence for a massive local inundation. A legend about a city swallowed by the sea might echo the memory of a coastal town lost to rising water or subsidence. A tale of visitors from beyond the horizon could trace back to one of the first encounters with an unfamiliar culture. This is crucial in the search for an unknown civilization, because myths might hold scraps of memory from times and places that left little or no physical trace. A people might forget the exact coordinates of a vanished homeland but retain descriptions of its climate, its animals, or the way its coastline looked. They might forget dates, but remember that a catastrophic event reshaped everything. Stories of enormous floods are among the most widespread. Nearly every region has some version. Waters that rose high enough to cover hills, rains that fell without stopping, waves that came from nowhere. In some versions, the flood is punishment. In others, it's simply a calamity. If we compare these tales to geological records, some align with known events, such as rapid flooding during the melting of glacial ice at the end of the last ice age. Others remain harder to match, but their persistence suggests they didn't arise randomly. If a civilization flourished along coastlines that are now underwater and was eventually destroyed or scattered by rising seas, survivors could have carried fragments of that story inland. Over generations, it would be woven into the traditions of other groups, until the original context was blurred, but the outline of the disaster remained. There are also myths about lost lands, Atlantis in Greek tradition, Kumari Kandam in Tamil lore, Lioness in Cornish legend, and others besides. Each is described as a place that was once prosperous and then disappeared, usually under the sea. Some of these tales are likely metaphor or political allegory. Others might be exaggerated memories of more modest events. But the recurring theme, the idea that a significant land can be present one generation and gone in the next, seems to resonate across cultures. In rare cases, myths preserve strikingly precise geographic hints. An island might be said to lie a certain number of days' travel in a particular direction, with cliffs of a particular color, or a bay shaped in a particular way. Without maps, such details must have come from actual journeys, either by the storytellers themselves or their distant ancestors. Stories of culture bringers are another fascinating category. Many traditions include figures who arrive from elsewhere and teach key skills: how to cultivate certain crops, how to navigate by the stars, how to smelt metal, or how to establish laws. Sometimes these figures are gods, sometimes semi-divine heroes, sometimes mysterious strangers who appear fully human but uncanny in their knowledge. In some versions, they stay and become part of the local lineage. In others, they leave once their work is done. The basic pattern is recognizable. An outside source brings transformative knowledge. If an unknown civilization once traveled widely, making contact with less developed groups, these encounters might be remembered in the only way available, turned into stories whose literal origins were forgotten, but whose structure remained. We also know that oral traditions can preserve real information far beyond what we might expect. In parts of Australia, Aboriginal stories describe coastlines as they were more than 7,000 years ago, before sea levels rose. These narratives don't just speak in generalities. They include specific features that can be matched with modern reconstructions of the ancient landscape. That tells us myth can serve as a remarkably stable container for certain facts, even while other aspects of a story change. Some myths include references to the sky, star patterns, the timing of eclipses, the appearance of comets or unusual celestial events. If those references can be matched to known astronomical phenomena, they can sometimes be dated. In a few cases, this has allowed researchers to estimate when a story first took shape, pushing it back thousands of years beyond the earliest written version. None of this means myths should be read as simple historical reports. They are shaped by the needs and values of the communities that tell them. Elements are added for drama, for moral instruction, for spiritual resonance. But that doesn't erase the possibility that beneath all of that, there's a memory of something that actually happened. Scholars who work with myths as potential windows into the past often treat them like complex puzzles. They break them down, compare them across regions, and look for shared, unusual details. If two distant peoples tell stories that share specific, unexpected elements, not just general themes, they may be drawing on a common origin, even if each has wrapped that origin in its own imagery. For those interested in a possible forgotten civilization, myths can function like a guide. Not a guide in the sense of giving step-by-step directions, but in the sense of pointing out where it might be worth looking more closely. If myths from several unconnected cultures all speak of a particular kind of place, event, or visitor, it may signal an underlying connection. There's even the suggestion that some myths were intentionally used as vessels for knowledge. A group without writing or worried that writing could be lost might weave important information about weather, geography, or agriculture into stories and rituals, knowing that narratives remembered for their emotional power would be more likely to survive. Whether that was done consciously or arose organically, the result is the same. A long chain of memory in which the experiences of people we've never heard of can still echo in tales told today. Some discoveries are easy to place the moment they're uncovered. They fit the era suggested by the soil around them. They match the tools and techniques we already associate with a particular culture. They confirm or slightly refine what we thought we understood. Then there are the other discoveries, the ones that don't sit where we expect them to. Objects that seem to have arrived early, far away, or in hands that, according to our timelines, shouldn't have possessed them. These are the out-of-place artifacts, the finds that press awkwardly against the neat flow of our standard history. Sometimes they're small, a metal implement in a layer of earth that appears to be centuries older than that type of metalworking, a piece of pottery whose style belongs by our current charts in a much later period. Other times they take the form of whole structures, sections of walls built with a method supposedly unknown at the time, statues carved from stone that had to be transported across impossible distances for that culture. The first reaction to such finds is often to suspect an error, and that's reasonable. Soil layers can shift through floods or landslides. People in later times can dig down, bury objects, or reuse older sites. Dating techniques come with margins of uncertainty, and our identifications of materials are not always perfect. But even after all that caution is applied, and the most obvious mistakes are ruled out, some artifacts remain stubbornly hard to explain. A carefully cast bronze object appears centuries before bronze is believed to have been used in that region. A fragment of a map seems to depict coastlines in uncanny detail long before the tools for such mapping supposedly existed. A gear-like device turns up among simple tools, raising the question of whether it represents a level of mechanical understanding much higher than anything else found nearby. One of the most famous examples is a corroded device recovered from a shipwreck off Greece in the early 1900s. For decades, it sat largely ignored, until closer study revealed that it was a highly complex mechanical calculator for predicting astronomical positions and eclipses. It dates back more than 2,000 years, and nothing approaching its sophistication appears again in the record for many centuries afterward. When it was first brought to light, many assumed it had to be much more recent, perhaps accidentally mixed in with older artifacts, but repeated analysis confirmed its age. Then there are more controversial claims objects said to have been found in rock layers millions of years old, or embedded in coal, far beyond any plausible human time frame. The mainstream view is that most of these are misunderstandings or misrepresentations, and in many cases there are solid reasons to say so. Still, the very persistence of such stories reflects a deep fascination with the idea that sophisticated knowledge might have existed long before our accepted timelines allow. If we think about an unknown civilization moving through the world, out-of-place artifacts might be the most tangible pieces of evidence they left scattered in their wake. A trader from a more advanced culture might carry distinctive goods, tools, ornaments, devices into regions where such things had never been seen, exchanging them for local resources. Generations later, those artifacts could be found in layers that otherwise reflect a much simpler level of technology. Or imagine survivors of a fallen culture traveling long distances and settling among other peoples. They might bring with them a few cherished objects, family tools, symbolic items that far exceed the local norms. Sometimes these anomalous objects appear alone, which makes them harder to interpret. A single advanced tool in an otherwise modest toolkit can be explained as a trade item, an heirloom, or even an experimental piece. But when similar anomalies start appearing across multiple sites with shared materials or construction methods, the chances increase that they're pointing to a common source. It isn't just tools and machines that raise such questions. Precious stones from distant mines, shells from far-off coasts, or decorative styles clearly borrowed from elsewhere can all suggest routes of contact that we haven't fully mapped. When such items show up in places and times where no known trade path connects them to their origin, they whisper of journeys and exchanges unrecorded in our histories. We also have to consider how often objects get reused. Picture a community stumbling onto the weathered remains of an older, more technologically capable town. They might not understand who built it, but they would easily recognize that some of the materials were valuable. They might pry stones from perfectly fitted walls to use in new, rougher constructions. They might salvage pieces of metal or wood, reshaping them for their own needs. Over time, the original context is dismantled, and the borrowed components are scattered into much younger layers of debris. Centuries later, archaeologists find a confusing mix, seemingly advanced fragments sitting inside a simpler cultural setting. In some instances, the craftsmanship itself is the puzzle. Certain carvings show symmetry and smoothness that suggest tools or techniques beyond what we think that period possessed. When similar carving styles are found on different continents, we have to ask whether this is coincidence, shared contact, or a misreading of the dates. The challenge is to avoid both extremes, dismissing every anomaly as an error, and at the same time resisting the urge to let a single strange item overturn everything we know. The careful path is slow. Serious researchers run more tests, gather more context, and explore alternative explanations before making big claims. Yet every time an out-of-place object is validated, even in a modest way, our timeline shifts a little. Sometimes the shift is small, recognizing that a particular metal was in use a bit earlier than we thought, or that a trade connection reached slightly farther. Other times, the adjustment is significant, forcing us to accept that two cultures we believed independent were actually in contact, or that a certain kind of complexity appeared earlier than our models predicted. The rarity of such artifacts is also notable. If a forgotten civilization existed, its physical remnants might be incredibly thinly spread, mixed into the sediments of other societies. Recognizing them would then require both luck in discovery and a keen eye to see that something doesn't quite belong. There's another possibility, that we've already found more of these pieces than we realize. but misfiled them. An odd tool might be cataloged as a ceremonial object. A fragment with unusual alloy composition might be lumped in with more typical metalwork. Museum storerooms and boxes of unprocessed finds might contain artifacts whose true significance will only emerge when better analytical methods or fresh perspectives are brought to them. In that sense, out-of-place objects are like loose threads sticking out from the fabric of our accepted story. Pull one, and it might snap harmlessly, revealing nothing new. Or it might begin to unravel a whole section, showing us patterns we didn't know were there. When we talk about history, we usually mean books, ruins, and physical relics. But there is another record, one each of us carries around inside our bodies. It doesn't sit in a museum or a library. It resides in the cells that make us in the sequences that influence everything from our eye color to how we weather disease. Our DNA is more than a personal blueprint. It's a layered archive of where our species has traveled and who has met whom across vast stretches of time. Genetic information stacks like geological layers. Some segments are extremely old, tracing back to our earliest human ancestors. Others are more recent, reflecting migrations and mixtures that took place only a few thousand years ago. Between those extremes lie countless traces of interactions, movements, unions, separations that may or may not match the stories recorded in text or inferred from artifacts. Modern genetic studies can detect these traces, showing when populations mixed or split. Sometimes the genetic story lines up neatly with what archaeology and written history already suggest. Sometimes it adds fine detail, like filling in missing lines on a map. And sometimes it reveals surprising connections between groups that we believed had little or no contact. One clear example is the discovery that nearly all people living outside of Africa today carry a small but measurable percentage of Neanderthal DNA. For a long time, the prevailing view was that modern humans and Neanderthals lived near one another, but had little direct contact beyond competition for land and resources. The genetic evidence forced a revision. They met, they formed families, and those meetings left a permanent mark in our genomes. Another case involves a group called the Denisovans, known almost entirely from fragmentary bones and teeth found in a single Siberian cave. We have very few physical remains, but we know from DNA that they contributed significantly to the ancestry of some populations in Oceania and parts of Asia. In other words, an entire branch of the human family tree was detected first, and most clearly not from bones in the ground, but from invisible signals in the cells of living people. In the context of an unknown civilization, genetic traces might reveal more than bones and artifacts ever could. If a relatively small, distinct population existed in a remote region and occasionally intermarried with neighboring groups, their genetic markers could survive for tens of thousands of years, even if everything else, settlements, tools, names, was eventually erased. This becomes especially relevant if we imagine a highly mobile seafaring people. If they traveled widely and had limited but repeated contact with various coastal communities, their DNA could be scattered across a broad area. The result might be subtle genetic signatures shared by populations that are, in other respects, quite different from one another. Genetic research also makes it possible to trace migrations in rough outline. By analyzing DNA from ancient skeletons and comparing it to that of modern populations, scientists can reconstruct movements. Who moved, where, when, and how many times groups split and rejoined. These patterns don't always mirror the paths we expect based on tools or pottery. Sometimes they suggest that people moved earlier or along different routes than we've assumed. Occasionally, the genetic record hints at what some researchers call ghost populations, groups that don't correspond to any known ancient samples but whose DNA must exist, because we can see its traces in living people. We may have no archaeological site we can definitely assign to such a group, no written record, no distinct artifact style. Yet their genetic legacy is unmistakable. If an unknown civilization once existed and left few durable remains, it's possible that it survives most clearly as one of these ghost components in our DNA. That doesn't mean they were dramatically different in appearance. Genetic distinctiveness often has more to do with long-term isolation than with any obvious outward traits, but it does mean that their genes move forward into the future even if their stories did not. Genetic clues can also reveal shared adaptations. Traits like the ability to digest lactose in adulthood or thrive in high mountain air spread through populations because they offer advantages. If two distant populations share a rare adaptation, it can indicate either descent from a common source or some kind of past contact. In some cases, we see these links before we find archaeological evidence to explain them. There's also the modern reality that millions of people now participate in commercial ancestry testing. The data collected while surrounded by ethical and privacy questions forms enormous genetic maps. Researchers sometimes use these to uncover unexpected relationships between far-flung groups, revealing migration patterns that never made it into official history. DNA, however, doesn't tell us everything. It can show that populations share ancestors, but not precisely how those people met, or what the nature of their relationships was. Admixture could come from peaceful exchange, forced movement, or anything in between. Genetic dating methods provide ranges of time rather than exact years. Still, DNA serves as a powerful compass, pointing toward places and eras where deeper investigation might uncover more direct evidence of contact. In some ways, genetics is the most inclusive historical record we have. It doesn't only remember rulers, city builders, or those wealthy enough to leave written monuments. It remembers everyone whose descendants are still alive. That includes people who left no grand structures, no carved inscriptions, and no objects durable enough to last. If a sophisticated or far-reaching civilization once existed and then disappeared, its only unmistakable trace might be the genes carried quietly in some of us today. Perhaps its members traveled, traded, or resettled far from their original homes, gradually blending in. Their tools may have rusted, and their buildings crumbled, but some fraction of their DNA survived through their children and their children's children. On its own, a shared genetic marker can't prove there was a lost civilization. It only shows that people once came together. But when such genetic hints are considered alongside other clues' unusual artifacts, puzzling architectural similarities, recurring myths, they can help strengthen the case that our deep past contained more complexity than we've yet documented. As genetic methods grow more refined, we may find more of these ghostly signatures fingerprints from populations that have no name in our histories but still live on within us. There are certain structures that stop you, not just because they are old or beautiful, but because they seem out of step with everything around them. The level of precision, the choice of materials, the scale of what's been attempted. They feel as though they belong to a different chapter of the human story than the one we've assigned them. We often talk about architecture as if it progresses along a clear path, from simple shelters to huts to houses to elaborate temples and fortresses. But in reality, architectural history is full of leaps and lulls. There are sudden bursts of innovation, periods where new forms and techniques appear with little warning, then vanish or shrink again, leaving behind a handful of puzzling examples. One of the most striking patterns is the use of massive stones cut and placed with an accuracy that borders on uncanny. At some sites, individual blocks weigh many tons, yet they are fitted together with joints so tight that even a thin blade can't be inserted between them. In a few cases, the arrangement seems to account for seismic activity, using interlocking shapes and slight flexibility so that walls can survive centuries of earthquakes. Elsewhere, we find complex vaults, arches, and drainage systems, appearing in contexts where, according to our timelines, such engineering knowledge shouldn't yet exist. Often, the explanation is that these methods were imported from neighboring cultures with more advanced traditions. But sometimes, we can't identify any neighboring culture that clearly possessed the skill either. We also see sites where the oldest parts are the most refined. A temple might rest on a platform of perfectly dressed stone, while the upper construction looks comparatively rough. A wall might show enormous, finely cut blocks at its base, with smaller, less well-fitted stones stacked on top from later repairs or additions. This inverted pattern, where the foundation is more sophisticated than what comes afterward, runs against the expectation of steady technical improvement. Then there are choices of stone that seem to defy practicality, except for reasons we're no longer sure of. Hard rocks like granite or basalt are much more difficult to work with than softer alternatives. Yet in some places, they were used extensively, carved and polished to a high degree, even though easier options were available. Sometimes these stones were transported long distances from quarries across rivers, plains, or up steep inclines. The logistics of this, without modern engines, are daunting. Although we have plausible methods involving sledges, rollers, and large labor forces, the exact approaches are not always obvious from the remains. In addition, small details in some constructions go beyond what we'd expect. Perfectly round holes, drilled deep into stone with consistent diameter, and spiral scoring suggest techniques that remove material rapidly and evenly. Reproducing the same marks today usually requires high-quality drill bits and steady rotary power. Yet by our current models, the people who made those holes had access only to simple hand tools. City layouts raise questions as well. Some early urban centers were organized with a level of planning that wouldn't look out of place much later in history. Grid systems, broad avenues, water distribution networks, and waste management appear in places where we would expect more ad hoc growth. That suggests not only technical ability, but also administrative vision, the capacity to coordinate large projects and plan for long-term use. How such sophistication emerges seemingly fully formed in certain settings is not always easy to explain using local developments alone. One way to interpret these architectural anomalies is to see them as results of lost exchanges. Perhaps travelers or small groups carried knowledge from one region to another, and that knowledge was put into practice for a time before disappearing. Another is that some communities inherited techniques from a previous culture that had occupied the same area one that no longer appears clearly in the official record. There are cases where a particular style of building shows no gradual evolution. It arrives on the scene already developed, as if the builders had long practice elsewhere. That's unusual because most construction methods typically go through experimental stages, cruder attempts, partial failures, gradual refinements. When we don't see those steps, it suggests we're missing part of the story. Alignments and orientations add another layer. Many ancient buildings are positioned very carefully to face cardinal directions or specific horizon points associated with solar or lunar events. In some cases, the accuracy of this alignment is extremely high impressive even with modern instruments. Doing this with nothing more than simple sighting tools and patient observation is possible, but not trivial. When we find this kind of precision combined with advanced structural techniques in places where they don't fit our usual developmental scheme, it raises the question of whether there might have been a shared knowledge base contributing to these achievements. Independently, each anomaly can be written off. Extraordinary talent here, a lucky experiment there. When a culture reaches some new height and then seems to abandon or forget it, we might blame social upheaval, resource shortages, or shifting priorities. But when the same patterned, sudden appearance of advanced architecture, lack of clear precursors, later simplification recurs across multiple regions, it's reasonable to ask whether we're seeing echoes of something broader. If an unknown civilization once possessed advanced understanding of building, engineering, and alignment, its influence might now be visible mainly in the oldest, most confusing parts of structures we attribute to others. Over time, as those techniques were only partially preserved, later builders might copy what they could see without fully understanding the principles behind them. The result would be monuments whose lower sections demonstrate remarkable skill and longevity, while upper sections show a more limited grasp. Architecture is fragile in its own way. Wars tear it down. Natural disasters crack and crumble it. Weather eats away its surfaces. Materials like wood and brick decay more quickly than stone. Even stone eventually wears under wind and rain. What we see today is only a fraction of what once stood, and the parts that impressed us most may have been the first to be damaged or looted. Yet, enough remains to raise persistent questions. Enough survives to suggest that somewhere deep in our shared past, there were people building in ways that do not entirely fit the straightforward story of steady, local progress we often tell. Tools provide another lens through which we track human advancement. We talk about the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age labels based on the dominant material used for cutting, carving, and shaping. We expect new tools to appear gradually, with old versions fading out once something better comes along. But sometimes, we find tools that don't follow that smooth curve. They appear suddenly, fully effective, and then disappear again, as if the knowledge to make them was lost. In some instances, these are literal implements: chisels, blades, drills, made from unusual materials or using complex treatments that seem ahead of their time. In other cases, they're more elaborate devices, measuring instruments, mechanical components, or chemical processes. These tools require not just raw materials, but a chain of knowledge: how to source those materials, how to refine or temper them, how to assemble and use them. When we uncover such objects and can't find any clear path leading up to them in the local record, we have to wonder where that chain began. In some situations, the disappearance of a tool can be explained straightforwardly. If the material used to make it came from a single mine or region that later became inaccessible due to climate change, conflict, or simple depletion, then the associated technology might fade as well. Alternatively, a newer, more versatile method might replace an older, specialized one so completely that the old approach no longer gets passed down. But there are other cases where we see advanced craftsmanship without clear cause or continuation. Stone surfaces that show signs of high-speed drilling or sawing, metal artifacts with levels of purity or alloy composition that would require careful control of temperature and ingredients control we don't associate with that time and place. In some periods, certain steels produced in small quantities were so resilient that they remained in good condition for centuries of hard use and exposure. Modern metallurgists have sometimes struggled to reverse engineer these materials, even with powerful analytical tools. Similarly, some ancient textiles reveal weaving so fine and consistent that duplicating it on a mass scale, even today, is not trivial. Natural dyes used in those fabrics can retain their color after thousands of years, their recipes unrecorded or only partially guessed. We also see evidence of sophisticated chemical knowledge: waterproofing agents, preservatives, strengthening compounds for stone or mortar. Analysis sometimes finds ingredients that must have been collected or traded from far away, hinting at networks and expertise we haven't fully charted. In certain cases, these tools and techniques don't seem to evolve locally step by step. Instead, they show up as if the makers already understood exactly what they were doing. Then, for reasons we can't always identify, that understanding stops being transmitted. This resembles what we see in architecture: sharp peaks of capability followed by decline or simplification. If some communities inherited tools and techniques from a more advanced source, it would help explain how such peaks arise without a clear buildup. Some tools may even be so specialized that we don't recognize their purpose. An object might look decorative but was actually designed for a very specific job. A small series of notches or markings might have functioned as measurements or instructions rather than ornaments. Without living practitioners to show us how these items were used, we're left to speculate. The loss of complex tools can result from many forms of disruption. Political collapse can scatter specialists. Warfare can destroy workshops. Environmental shifts can make old techniques impractical. If producing a particular device required a cluster of craftspeople with complementary skills, the break in any one link could end the whole tradition. Oral instruction alone can preserve detailed craft methods for centuries, but only if someone continues to practice them. Once a tool stops being needed or valued, its making can vanish within a few generations. Occasionally, though, we rediscover these lost tools or methods through experiment. A researcher studying ancient pottery might find microscopic traces of a glaze and work with chemists to reproduce it. A historian reading an old manuscript might encounter a drawing of a mechanism and build a model to see how it would function. Successes in these reconstructions show that the past often held more subtle, practical ingenuity than we've given it credit for. In the framework of an unknown civilization, tools we've forgotten how to make could represent some of the most decisive evidence of their influence. Physical objects with measurable properties and reproducible tests can be more difficult to deny or reinterpret than stories or alignments alone. If we consistently find advanced implements in contexts where they have no obvious developmental path, it suggests that knowledge was flowing from somewhere else. The difficulty, as always, lies in scale. A single extraordinary artifact is easy to write off as trade, experiment, or fluke. A pattern of similar finds, scattered around the world and through different cultures, is harder to ignore. In some places, we already see that the most sophisticated examples of a certain craft appear early, with later versions growing simpler or cruder. That's not what we would expect from continuous progress, but it does align with knowledge being handed down from a culture already at a high level, then gradually fading as details are lost. When we consider the tools we no longer know how to replicate, it's natural to wonder what else is missing. Whole categories of devices and processes that didn't survive long enough for us to find even fragments. Every so often, a discovery reminds us that our history is shaped as much by what we've lost as by what we've learned. The ocean may be the largest, least read archive on Earth. It blankets more than 2/3 of the planet, and large portions of its floor remain nearly as mysterious to us as the surfaces of distant moons. Under that moving skin of water lie mountains higher than those on land, canyons deeper than anything above sea level, and uncounted locations no one has yet seen directly. It's a vast, shifting vault of history, where traces of the past can be preserved for millennia or swept away in an instant. What makes the ocean especially challenging is its double nature. In some environments, the cold, dark, low oxygen conditions can slow decay to a crawl, preserving shipwrecks, wooden structures, and even organic materials in remarkable condition. In others, powerful currents, storms, and chemical processes can break objects down quickly. The sea protects and destroys, but not according to any rules that are easy for us to anticipate. If a civilization once flourished along ancient shorelines, the ocean may have become both their grave and their guardian. At the end of the last ice age, as massive ice sheets melted, sea levels rose dramatically over 100 meters globally. Coastal plains that had been habitable for thousands of years were gradually inundated. Any towns, fields, or ports built there would now lie underwater, buried under layers of sediment and out of sight from casual exploration. It makes sense that early complex societies would cluster near coasts. There, people could draw food from both land and sea, trade easily with neighbors, and take advantage of natural harbors. But as the waters crept higher, those same areas would have been vulnerable. The physical traces of their existence, stone foundations, harbor walls, quays, docks, might now rest on the seafloor, softened by erosion and draped in marine life. Modern sonar and remote-operated submersibles have begun to reveal just how much lies hidden. Scans sometimes show patterns of straight lines and right angles where none should occur naturally. Divers occasionally find cut stones or worked timbers at depths that suggest an older, now-drowned landscape. But exploring underwater is expensive and slow. Detailed mapping of even a modest stretch of seabed requires time, equipment, and expertise. Many areas have only been surveyed with coarse resolution tools that can't detect smaller structures. Visibility in some waters is so poor that even if you're close to a feature, you may not realize it's there. And then there's the question of interpretation. The ocean floor is a dynamic environment. Rocks tumble, sediments shift, and biological growth can disguise the outlines of once clear shapes. Without artifacts like pottery, tools, or inscriptions, it's difficult to convince others that a submerged formation is of human origin and not just an unusual natural formation. Still, the seas have yielded striking finds. Ancient ships sitting almost intact on the bottom, their cargoes of amphorae, metals, or other goods giving us direct insight into trade routes. Sunken harbors and seawalls just beyond modern shorelines, showing where the waterline used to be. Fossilized river valleys and forests now under the waves, some with traces of human activity preserved in the sediments. In river deltas and continental shelves, stone tools and hearth remains have been discovered in layers that were once dry land, confirming that people lived where there is now only open water. If we entertain the idea of a seafaring civilization, one deeply at home along coasts and islands, the implications are striking. Their main hub ports, shipyards, trading towns would be among the first places lost to rising seas or storm surges. Inland traces might exist, but the heart of their world could be underwater. Even if their ships traveled across great distances without access to their primary settlements, it would be much harder for us to reconstruct the full scope of their activities. Some parts of the ocean are especially good at preserving the past. In deep, cold basins with limited oxygen, wooden structures can remain intact for thousands of years. In some northern waters, entire ships have been found with masts and rigging still recognizable. If a vessel from a culture we don't yet know about were found in such a state, it could offer a snapshot of technologies and practices otherwise invisible to us. The ocean also preserves patterns in less direct ways. Fish migrations, seasonal currents, and wind systems would have shaped how ancient mariners traveled. If we track the spread of certain goods shells, obsidian, metals, even plant species used for food or medicine, we can sometimes infer which routes were used frequently. In a few traditions, myths speak of lands beneath the waves or of ancestral homes swallowed by the sea. Such stories might be highly embellished over time, but they could carry kernels of memory from when people watched familiar shorelines sink year after year. Today, technology is expanding our vision of what lies below. Autonomous underwater vehicles can scan wide areas in fine detail. Imaging tools can peer through murky water and build three-dimensional models of submerged landscapes. Yet for each new wreck or drowned structure we identify, there are countless more we haven't so much as glimpsed. If an unknown civilization flourished primarily in coastal zones during a period of unstable sea levels, much of their material culture could now be in places we rarely look in detail. That leaves the ocean as a kind of keeper of untold stories. A vast, darkened archive where clues to our deeper past may rest for millennia before we're able to retrieve and interpret them. The night sky is one of the very few constants shared by all human generations. Continents drift, rivers carve new courses, cities rise and fall, but the stars remain, shifting only slowly over thousands of years. Long before telescopes or precise instruments, people learned to watch that sky carefully. With nothing more than patience and memory, they recognized that the heavens could act as clock, compass, and calendar all at once. Many ancient sites around the world show deliberate astronomical design. Stones set to frame the sunrise or sunset at particular times of year. Openings cut so that a shaft of light falls into a chamber on a solstice. Alignments that trace lunar cycles or mark the rising of key stars. For most known cultures, these alignments made practical and spiritual sense. Knowing when seasons would turn was essential for agriculture. Ritual calendars tied celestial events to festivals and ceremonies, but in some places, the precision and range of the alignments suggest something more than basic seasonal marking. When buildings relate not just to the sun and moon, but also to specific stars or constellations, and when those alignments would only have been exact thousands of years earlier due to the slow wobble of Earth's axis, it implies either very long-term observation or inherited knowledge. A seafaring people especially would have relied on the stars to navigate. On open water, where landmarks vanish over the horizon, the sky becomes the only reliable reference. By learning which stars appear where and when and how their positions change throughout the year, navigators can estimate their direction and latitude. If an unknown civilization specialized in long-distance voyaging, they might have developed star lore and sky measurements far more detailed than those of neighboring land-based groups. Some ancient cultures clearly track the wanderings of planets as well as the fixed stars. Planets move in complex ways, sometimes seeming to reverse direction against the backdrop of the constellations. Predicting their paths requires careful, repeated observation and systematic record-keeping. In certain traditions, these observations were encoded in stories, myths, or even in the arrangement of monuments. Constellations served as memory aids. A cluster of stars might be associated with a narrative that, when recited, also encoded information about navigation, seasonal changes, or rare events such as eclipses. Because stories are easier to memorize and transmit than lists of numbers, this approach allowed knowledge to survive in cultures without writing. What's fascinating is that similar uses of the sky show up in many unconnected places. Different peoples imagine different shapes in the stars. A hunter here, a canoe there, but the habit of tying stories and practical knowledge to the sky seems almost universal. If a now-vanished culture shared its astronomical methods widely, traces of its system might linger in the shared features of these traditions. Some ancient calendars are astonishingly precise. They track the solar year with very small errors over long stretches of time. Some incorporate multiple cycles at once: solar, lunar, ritual, interlocking them in sophisticated ways. Creating and maintaining such calendars suggests a deep engagement with periodic cycles and an ability to apply fairly advanced mathematical thinking. If a forgotten group once mapped the sky thoroughly and used that map for navigation and timekeeping, their influence could show up indirectly in later structures, stories, and calendars. A temple aligned both to a local sunrise and a star that has no immediate link to daily life might reflect borrowed knowledge about that star's significance. We do need to be careful when interpreting alignments. Over centuries, buildings shift, foundations sink, and repairs alter original layouts. Not every coincidence of line and star is intentional. But when a site shows multiple, consistent alignments that all point to meaningful celestial events, the likelihood of chance diminishes. The sky also offers something unique. It's a shared frame of reference between us and the people we're trying to understand. Even though the positions of stars change slowly over time, we can reconstruct how the sky looked thousands of years ago. That allows us to test whether alignments that seem significant today would have been significant then. In some cases, we've matched carvings of star patterns or eclipse depictions to specific dates and viewpoints in the past. If such matches point to times well before the accepted beginnings of a culture, it may mean the knowledge behind them is older than the culture itself. For an unknown civilization, the sky would have been both canvas and codebook. A way to unify scattered communities, coordinate travel and trade, and anchor myths intended to preserve knowledge. And because the stars are still overhead, we have an unusual opportunity to use the same reference points our distant ancestors did as we search for signs of their understanding. Trade is among the oldest threads running through human history. Long before coins or written contracts, people were exchanging what they had for what they lacked: flint for shells, food for tools, pigments for cloth. Over time, these exchanges formed routes paths across land and water that carried not just goods, but stories and ideas. Most of the trade networks we know about followed practical lines: rivers, coastlines, passes through mountains. We reconstruct them by tracking where specific materials show up: obsidian from a particular volcanic source found in tools many miles away, shells from a distant shore buried in inland graves, metals from one region worked in another. Usually these distributions align with what we know about ancient geography and travel. But sometimes they don't. Items turn up impossibly far from their source, at times when we don't think there were routes capable of carrying them so far, or among cultures with no obvious reason to have interacted. When this happens, we're confronted with the possibility of trade networks older, wider, or more complex than we've charted. Gems found in tombs thousands of miles from the only known mines, artifacts made from ores that come from across a sea, at dates before official histories describe such sea crossings, food crops appearing on new continents centuries or millennia before our accepted dates for their introduction. For example, certain plants native to one continent have been detected in archaeological layers on another long before the era of well-documented transoceanic voyages. If such findings hold up under scrutiny, they require explanations beyond what we currently accept. Someone had to move those seeds or plants and successfully cultivate them. Techniques for working metal likewise spread in patterns that can be hard to explain with purely local invention. When nearly identical alloy recipes or smelting methods appear in regions separated by vast distances, we have to consider whether knowledge, as well as goods, traveled along routes we haven't recognized. If there was a civilization with extensive maritime expertise, its traders could have connected continents, passing through many intermediate communities. They might have left only light, temporary traces of their own presence, but the goods and ideas they carried would continue their journeys in other people's hands. This kind of network doesn't look like the stable, named trade routes we know from later periods. It could have been fluid, changing with climate, politics, and the fortunes of particular groups. Routes might open for a few generations, then close again when river levels shifted, storms worsened, or key mediating communities moved or declined. The physical traces of these early routes are subtle. You won't always find roads or caravanserais. Instead, you see patterns in where foreign materials show up, how technologies appear and spread, and where myths place encounters with outsiders. In some cases, oral traditions mention strangers arriving by boat, carrying novel goods or unfamiliar customs. These stories may describe the newcomers as magical beings or culture heroes, but behind the embellishment there might be memories of visiting traders. Overland, climate change can erase paths just as effectively as the sea. Deserts expand to cover once fertile corridors. Forests encroach on open grasslands. Rivers carve new channels or dry up entirely. Ancient roads and trails can be swallowed by new vegetation or worn down until they're indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. Modern tools are starting to expose some of these forgotten paths. Satellite imagery can reveal faint, linear depressions or soil disturbances characteristic of old roads. Chemical analysis of artifacts can pinpoint where the raw materials came from. When you find a sequence of sites containing goods from the same distant source, strung out in a line, it suggests a route that people walked or sailed again and again. If a long-lost civilization coordinated or dominated some of these early trade systems, their influence could be woven into the spread of technologies and crops, without leaving clearly labeled ruins. The problem is that routes themselves leave little behind once they go out of use. What remains are the goods, but those can move many times, hopscotching from hand to hand, obscuring the original path. Still, when certain materials show up consistently where they shouldn't, when similar techniques and artistic styles appear in cities separated by oceans, and when myths from different regions allude to visitors from afar, we begin to see hints of a much larger web of exchange than our current historical maps show. Plants travel where people travel. Sometimes it happens by accident. A seed caught in the tread of a sandal, stuck to an animal skin, mixed in with stored grain. Sometimes it's entirely intentional favorite foods, useful fibers, or medicinal herbs carried along as groups migrate or explore. Over the long term, these movements leave a botanical imprint that researchers can follow. When a crop native to one region appears far beyond its natural range, especially in contexts that suggest cultivation rather than mere chance growth, it almost always means someone deliberately moved it. Archaeologists can sometimes track the first appearance of a plant in a new area through preserved seeds, pollen, or plant fibers in ancient soils and artifacts. Often these arrivals match what we know about human migrations or trade. But occasionally, a plant shows up earlier than expected, or in a place not easily connected by known routes. These are the botanical analogs to out-of-place artifacts. They may not look impressive, but they can be powerful indicators of contact. Take, for instance, a root crop or grain suddenly appearing in the diet of a culture far from its origin, alongside evidence that it was being grown systematically. For that to happen, someone had to bring the seeds or cuttings and also knew how to plant, tend, and process them. Certain crops require curing, fermenting, or careful timing to be nutritious or safe to eat. Where such knowledge seems to appear all at once, it suggests a transfer of expertise along with the plant itself. Genetic studies of crops add another dimension. By sequencing the DNA of plant varieties from different regions, scientists can reconstruct their family trees. Sometimes, this reveals that a plant grown in one part of the world is closely related to a type found in a distant area, bypassing intermediate regions. That points to either long-distance movement or very old connections that we haven't yet documented. Sweet potatoes in Polynesia, cotton varieties across continents, and other such cases have fueled debates about early contacts. These stories don't always require a massive seafaring empire to explain them, but they do require someone to have made journeys we haven't fully recognized. Plants can also reflect past climates. If botanical remains show that a species once grew in a region where today's climate would not allow it, it might indicate a different environment in the past or import from elsewhere. Both possibilities feed back into our understanding of where and how ancient people could have lived. Plants decay quickly compared to stone. Seeds rot. Fibers break down. and wood crumbles. But in special conditions, extreme dryness, cold, or waterlogged, low oxygen soils, they can last long enough to be studied. Even when the physical pieces are gone, they sometimes leave chemical signatures in pottery, cooking residues, or dental tartar on ancient teeth. Those traces can reveal which plants people were eating, storing, or using in other ways. If an unknown civilization had a hand in moving certain key crops across great distances, their silent legacy might live on every time we prepare or eat those foods. A grain in one country may owe its presence there to a voyage made thousands of years ago by people whose names and stories have been lost. Likewise, a particular method of tending fields or rotating crops might have been introduced so long ago that no one remembers it as an invention at all. Plants might seem like humble evidence compared to grand monuments or intricate machines, but they are deeply bound up with how humans live, survive, and expand. Each unexpected seed, each genetic link across continents is like a faint footprint on an ancient path, evidence that someone walked there, carrying life with them, long before we realized such a journey had taken place. When we look at the rise of civilizations, we recognize Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, early China, the pre-Columbian states of the Americas. We usually focus on what they appear to have developed within their own boundaries. Their writing systems, their distinctive art, their political structures, their engineering feats. We treat each as a largely self-contained story, shaped by local resources and challenges. But if we allow for the possibility of an earlier, influential civilization, the picture starts to shift. Many of the earliest phases of these cultures show a rapid leap from small-scale communities to sophisticated urban centers. Irrigation systems appear, administrative tools blossom, monumental architecture rises, sometimes in what feels like a very short span of time. Some of this can absolutely be explained by internal innovation, the cumulative result of generations of trial and error. Yet there are moments where the speed and coordination of change raise questions. A city might emerge with an already complex layout, complete with zoning, defenses, and water management. A new building technique might appear fully formed, with no clearly documented steps leading up to it. If a more advanced group made contact with these early societies, whether as travelers, refugees, or neighbors, they could have shared key pieces of knowledge. Those receiving the knowledge might adapt and expand it in their own ways, but the initial spark would still have an external origin. Importantly, influence does not mean dependency. A culture can take outside ideas and remix them so thoroughly that the result is something genuinely new. Even so, if we imagine a guiding or contributing civilization, some of what we consider independent breakthroughs may in fact be part of a longer chain. Oral traditions from many places include stories of people learning from outsiders, strangers who appear with new crops or new ways to measure time. Teachers who show up, share a crucial technique, and then vanish from the narrative. These accounts are often embellished and mythologized, but the underlying pattern appears again and again. It's not proof of anything on its own, but it's suggestive. If such an unknown civilization did exist and eventually disappeared, its contributions might be almost invisible in the historical record. They would have been absorbed into the fabric of other cultures, their origins forgotten or transformed into legend. A method of surveying land might become standard practice, a type of grain might become a staple food, a style of stone cutting might become a normal part of construction. The fact that these things started somewhere else would be irrelevant to the people using them. From our perspective, this raises a humbling possibility that some of the foundations of our world were laid by hands we don't know, living in places whose names have never been written down. When we think about civilizations that vanish, we tend to picture dramatic endings, wars, plagues, cataclysms. But disappearance in the historical sense doesn't always look like that. A group can cease to be recognized as distinct without going extinct. They can be absorbed, transformed, scattered, or simply change so much that we no longer see them as the same people. If an unknown civilization once played a significant role in shaping human development, it might still be present in subtle forms. It could survive in certain communities' customs, in language fragments, in genetic lineages, or in quietly preserved crafts. Some groups today maintain ways of life that seem finely tuned to their environments. Mountain, desert, forest, in ways that suggest very long-term continuity. It's conceivable that threads of a lost civilization's knowledge run through such communities, though identifying them would be extremely difficult. They might themselves have only faint memories, if any, of an earlier, grander past. Or their histories may be encoded in stories that outsiders dismiss as simple folklore. In other cases, the civilization's identity may have dissolved completely, leaving behind only what we can now recognize as a soft footprint. Techniques, crops, ideas, and stories diffuse so widely that no one thinks to ask where they began. We don't need secret hidden cities or untouched islands to imagine this kind of survival. All it requires is that some part of them, whether people or knowledge, continue to exist in changing forms, camouflaged by time. When we talk about legacy, we often reach first for what can be seen and touched. Columns, inscriptions, artifacts in glass cases. But much of what truly lasts from any civilization is quieter. It lives in practices so ordinary that we rarely pause to notice them. In the way we organize space, the rhythms of our work and rest, the cycles of planting and harvesting, the stories we tell to children at night. If a forgotten civilization once helped shape the main currents of human life, a great deal of what they gave us is likely hiding in those everyday patterns. The way streets in certain old cities bend and connect, the methods we use to store food against scarcity, the most efficient designs of tools we still prefer after countless refinements. All of these might, in part, be echoes. Influence doesn't require monuments to endure. A handful of ideas, passed along and reshaped, can outlast stone. A single well-adapted crop can feed millions of people for thousands of years. A reliable method for navigating by stars can spread from one coastline to another, changing how people move and trade. Languages keep traces of those who came before in borrowed words and unusual structures. Spiritual beliefs and rituals can carry forward the concerns, hopes, and fears of cultures long gone. Artistic motifs can persist as just tradition long after their original meaning faded. As modern tools for studying genetics, linguistics, and archaeology continue to improve, we may begin to see more clearly where some of these threads originate. We may find patterns that point to a shared source older than any of our currently named civilizations. Or we may never be able to fully reconstruct that story. Even then, the idea itself has value. It reminds us that history is not just what's carved in stone. It's also what's baked into the habits we barely notice and the assumptions we rarely question. If such an unknown civilization did exist, then in a very real sense, it hasn't entirely vanished. It lives on in the shape of the world we've inherited, in the foods we grow, the tools we use, the stories we repeat. Not as a lost city waiting to be uncovered in a single dramatic moment, but as a quiet, continuous presence in the background of our lives. Thank you for spending this stretch of time walking through these possibilities with me. If this way of looking at the past speaks to you, there are many more paths we can follow together, many more unanswered questions to sit with. Until we meet again, take care of yourself, and keep wondering about the stories the world hasn't yet had the chance or the tools to tell us.